I want today to focus on an argument that is maybe the most common sort of argument that empiricists have given in favor of God's existence, the cosmological argument. Cosmology is the study of the universe, and so this is an argument about the nature of the universe, and in particular about the universe having a cause. Before we get to the details of that, though, let's think about what it means to argue about whether or not there's a God. What is your idea of God? Now, maybe you believe in God, maybe you don't, but either way, you must have some view of what God is or would be. So, what comes into your mind when you just hear the term God? Yeah. Say it again. Omnipotent. Okay, yes. All powerful. What else? Yeah. All good. All knowing. What else? Yeah. Wholly good. Excellent. Other things. Yeah. Creator of the universe. Excellent. Yes. Eternal. Well, does any image come into your mind? Is. In general, the classical conception of God is that God is, well, a being that has these kinds of characteristics. So is omnipotent, all-powerful. Omnipresent, exists everywhere. Is omniscient, all-knowing. Is eternal, everlasting. Is transcendent, in some sense beyond this world. And finally, is compassionate, is caring, has moral qualities, like perfect goodness, perfect justice, and so on. And so, classical theism is the view that there is such a God that fits this kind of definition. Now, there are different ways of actually understanding God's definition or essence or something like that. Some thinkers think you can express that the greater than which cannot be conceived, or the perfect being, or the necessary being, or the first cause, or something like that. And other thinkers are going to say, no, in the end, we really aren't capable of knowing the essence of God. But in any case, God is a being with all of those kinds of properties, all of those perfections. There are, however, a number of, you might call them dissident conceptions that are not in accordance with that classical view of God. So, for example, one set of thinkers holds to what is known as the via negativa, that is to say, the negative way of understanding God. According to these thinkers, usually mystics, we can't really explain what God is. The best we can do is say what God is not. And so we can say God is not limited. God is not evil. God is not this or that or that other thing. But when it comes to giving a positive conception of God, we can't really do it. Certain schools of Hinduism, with respect to Brahman, have just that view. Or Taoists, with respect to the Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, says the Tao Te Ching, for example. A second dissident conception is deism. That says there is a God, but not a God who interacts in any way with the world. The image here is sort of God set up the universe, created it, but then just left it alone. And so God created the world on this view, but has no further interaction with it. So almost every particular religion, from a deist point of view, turns out to be talking about the right kind of being, but saying a lot of false things about it. A pantheist actually just identifies God with the universe, says God is everything. So God is just equal to nature. There is something spiritual, something divine about the world as it is, about nature itself. And so the pantheist typically says, look, a lot of people are going to draw a distinction between the world of nature, the world of our experience, and so on, and then this supernatural realm, the transcendent realm, where God is. The pantheist says, that's not a distinction I'm willing to draw. Actually, the transcendent is right here. And so American transcendentalists, for example, such as Emerson or Thoreau, tend to have this sort of view. There is a divinity about this world, a spirituality of this world, but there's nothing that goes beyond. Panentheism is a view that says nature is a part of God, but not the entire thing. So God includes everything. God includes the universe. However, God also is transcendent and going beyond the universe. Well, mostly, we're going to focus on that classical conception of God, but the cosmological argument, as we'll see, is one that could apply to a number of different conceptions, whether they're classical or not. Now, in general, arguments for and against the existence of God could be classified as either a priori or a posteriori. The a priori ones are going to say, independently of experience, just through reflection, we can determine something about whether or not God exists. And we'll look at arguments like that later under the heading of the rationalist tradition. But the empiricist is going to say, look, all knowledge, and in particular all knowledge of existence, is going to come from experience ultimately. So an empiricist is not going to like any argument like that. Empiricists tend to focus on arguments that are a posteriori, that are dependent on experience, and focus on something about our experience of the world to start the argument. So that's what these arguments are going to be like. The cosmological argument is really concerned with one particular facet of the conception of God we've been talking about, God as creator. And so here you see the Sistine Chapel image of God creating Adam. That's the kind of thing that the cosmological argument is inspired by, thinking about God as the creator of the universe. Well, we might start with a conception then of God as creator. In Aristotle, God is the prime mover of the universe, the being that gets it all going, the one that first puts things into motion. In Aquinas, similarly, God is the first cause. Lots of things cause lots of other things, but something began the entire thing, began the entire universe, and that thing was God, the first cause. And then in Avicenna, it's a beginning point that looks different, though isn't really very different in the end, as we'll see. It's a conception of God as the necessary being. Well, all of those conceptions are ones that go along nicely with a cosmological argument. They are maybe not required for a cosmological argument, but they are natural ways of thinking about God if we take this argument. I want to appeal to a super simple version of this that appears in some of the Nyaya Vaisheshika texts. The earth is an effect, like a pot. Therefore it has a pot. And in fact, like a pot, it has an intelligent cause, namely God. You could also think of this actually as a kind of proto-design argument. We'll talk about those next time. That's a very simple argument, and probably not very convincing. For one thing, it's super short. But secondly, why might that argument not seem very convincing? Yeah. Ooh, well, one thing is, even if the Earth does have a cause, why would we think the cause has to be God? Maybe the cause was the Big Bang. Maybe the cause was something else. And so, first of all, it's pretty weak on that connection to God. Is there anything else that's weird about it? Yeah?
It isn't drawing a distinction between something that's obviously designed and something that's doesn't really have a purpose. Like a pot has a purpose, but
okay, good. The Earth is, in effect, like a pot. Well, in what ways is the Earth like a pot? It's like a pot in some ways, but not like a pot in other ways. And you might think, I know what a pot is for example. I don't know what the world is for, what the universe is for. And we'll come back to that next time. But you also might think, look, the Earth is an effect. Why should I believe that in the first place, right? Why should I think there's enough similarity here to get this right? So a lot of people would say, this argument isn't that compelling. Although to be fair, in the Nyaya tradition, this gets developed a great deal. Buddhists especially attack it. Various Hindu schools defend it. And so there's much more to be said about this core argument as the tradition continues. I want to look at a couple of arguments that have appeared in other traditions, however, that are somewhat more familiar to most people in contemporary philosophy. Here is one that is a classic source of the cosmological argument. It's in Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and it is one of his 5 ways of proving that God exists. So here's how it goes. The second way is based on the nature of causation. In the observable world, causes are to be founded, ordered in series. We never observe or even could observe something causing itself. For this would mean it preceded itself, and this is impossible. So, we find causes in series. Nothing can cause itself. Such a series of causes must stop somewhere. For in all series, an earlier member causes an intermediate, and the intermediate a last. If you eliminate a cause, you eliminate its effects. So there can be neither a last nor an intermediate cause unless there is a first. But if the series of causes goes on to infinity, and there is no first cause, there would be neither intermediate causes nor a final effect. But that's patently false. So he's saying, look, we find things ordered in a series. Now, could that series go on to infinity? He says no, because we could never have gotten here. Okay? If this went back infinitely, then infinitely many things would have had to happen for us to get to this point. But that's an absurd idea. So he says, it is necessary to posit a first cause, which everyone calls God. Now, let's try to be a little more precise about the argument. Let's let A be just the current state of the world, the universe as it is at the moment, okay? Well, it was caused by actually a very complex set of factors, so let's assume that it resulted from B as its cause, some earlier state of the universe. That was in turn caused by C, that was caused by D, and here I'm supposed to be going back in time, okay, as I do this. And now, could that go on to infinity? Well, he says no. Otherwise, we'd never have reached this current stage. Infinitely many states of the world would have had to transpire to get here. He says that idea doesn't make any sense. So there's got to be a first cause, namely God. Now, what do you think of that? Yes?
I think that just because something doesn't make sense to us, it doesn't necessarily feel any insights about what that, what it could be.
Oh, good. All right. Just because something doesn't make sense to us doesn't really tell us anything about what it could be. So, in particular, I assume you're talking about that idea that it can't go on to infinity, right? I have a hard time imagining that infinitely many things have taken place up to now that really the history of the world is infinite. So you might say, gosh, what is the true star date today based on the origins of the universe? And say, well, it's infinite, man, because it really had no origin. It just goes back forever in time. So we're really at star date infinity plus something. That strikes us as weird, I think. On the other hand, you could say, look, being weird, that's not much of an argument. Does that show that it's impossible? It just seems strange, but it doesn't seem like, it's a completely incoherent or contradictory idea. Yeah?
I found that this is that we kind of envision A as like a destination, but it could be a point in a series and it's like an infinite series. Infinity includes the number 6, but that doesn't mean that 6 is infinite.
Right. Well, good. So yeah, A is sort of the thing today. So really, I should have drawn this with a bunch of arrows going the other direction and the other sort of thing. So, A1, A2, A3, and those would be future states. A isn't like the final resting point. It's not like, the entire history of the universe has been leading up to this moment. Enjoy it! Look, this is what it was all about. So, this just gets succeeded by the next one. And so you're absolutely right. Here we're just looking at the backward side of this, but presumably there's a forward side too. And actually the forward side going on forever, that doesn't seem so strange. If I said, what if the world just continues forever? Probably you wouldn't say, that's preposterous, or impossible, or incoherent, or what a weird, ridiculous idea. And so what is it about this idea of it going backwards that makes it especially strange? Yeah?
This is an empiricist argument, correct?
Right, it is supposed to be an empiricist argument.
So how would we be able to find out that there isn't an infinite number of causes that led up to this very moment?
Good, okay, yeah. In fact, in general, in this argument, you might say, wait, where's the a posteriori part? Where's the experience that's supposed to support any of this? Well, one place is just the world exists, okay? Another is to say, and here Aquinas in this version isn't super explicit about this, but the idea is really every state of the world has some cause. So we've got to assume that. We've got to assume that causes do not loop around, that nothing is a cause of itself. So there are various things we have to assume to get this to be a series instead of some looping circular thing or what have you. So all of those are things that he would say, I'm assuming those as premises, and I take it that experience supports those things. Do you think experience supports the idea that some things exist? Sure. That things have causes? Yeah. That nothing causes itself? Well, that's a little harder, but we think, that does seem. If you go to the doctor and say, I got sick, I don't know what's going on, coughing, and the doctor says, well, this state of coughing just caused itself. You think, you find a new doctor, right? You think that's bizarre. So there's something about that that's generally dependent on experience. And those things seem moderately plausible. But the infinity part, what's the experience that supports that? That seems much more puzzling. And so it's harder to understand where that could be coming from. I think you're absolutely right. Now, if you look at the tradition here, there are two primary issues people worry about. One is that first question we've been discussing. Why can't this go on to infinity? What is really the support for that part of the argument? Do we have an argument against that kind of backwards infinite chain? Presumably, as I've said, if it's one going into the future, it doesn't bother people. So what is it about an infinite chain going into the past that really seems disturbing, if there is anything disturbing about it? But the second issue that people have raised is, well, suppose there is a first cause. What do you mean everybody calls it God? Why should I think that first cause is God? And in particular, how do I get from the first cause to all those properties of God? Presumably, the first cause would be something like a creator of the universe. So that requires a being that is immensely powerful. But all-powerful? Are we sure that the creator would have to be all-powerful? And all-good? And all-knowing? And so on? And, I mean, I created those quizzes that you're taking, but do you look at them and think, oh, he must be all-knowing? Well, that was a joke. It's a laugh. But you could, actually, we're going to see an argument like this in Hume, who challenges this and says, I don't see how you get from first cause to God and all those other properties you claim about this. After all, what if somebody said, the first cause is the Big Bang? Do you think, I'm going to start the Church of the Big Bang and start writing hymns to the Big Bang, and I worship the Big Bang? No, right? There's something here that takes you from the first cause to God, to the being that religions are about and that worship is directed to, and so forth. Well, what's that connection? How do you get it? It's not obvious from the argument itself. Well, this argument comes under discussion extensively in the Islamic philosophical tradition. So I want to look at a version of it there and then some criticisms, and especially a revised version. Avicenna gives us one that involves this idea of God being the necessary being. He says, there is in being a being which has no reason for its being, which is how he defines necessity. If you're contingent, there's some reason why you exist. But if you are a being that is necessary, there is no reason for your being. You just are by your very nature. So he says, look, what's contingent can't enter into being except for some reason that sways the scales in favor of its being instead of not being. Well, if that reason is contingent, there is a chain of things, contingents, that all of this depends on. But he says then there's no being at all, because things would never enter into being unless they were preceded by an infinite succession of beings. And now notice the same thing, which is absurd. So he says, this chain of contingent beings end in a necessary being. In other words, my existence depended on, well, the existence of my parents, for example, and my father's getting a leave at the right time to go visit my mother, or actually for her to come visit him, etc. He was in the army at the time. And so all of these things are things upon which my being is contingent. Well, the being of those things is contingent, and so forth and so on. Could infinitely many things be contingents that underlie my being? In other words, can we say, look, I can exist only because of this infinite chain of things that I depend on? Well, he says, no, that's absurd. There must be a necessary being in the back of it. So, the basic structure of the argument is this. Suppose everything were contingent. Well, there'd be one thing linked to another in a chain that's infinitely long. I'd depend on something else. Those things would depend on other things, and that would go on forever. But look, that means infinitely many beings would have to exist before I, for example, could exist. But therefore nothing would exist. So something must be necessary underlying all of this, whose being gets the being of everything else from it. But you can probably see this is the same argument, just expressed in terms of contingency and in terms of dependence, rather than in terms of causation in quite the same way. Well, could there be two of these necessary beings? After all, we've said nothing about there being just one. He says, well, the distinction between them would have to be essential or accidental, but accidents are contingent. And so, once again, we get contingent beings. And if it's essential, they've got to be compounds, but all compounds are contingent. So, no, he says, there couldn't be more than one necessary being. Well, there's a lot to say about that if we wanted to, but I don't want to. So let's go on to the main criticism of this argument in Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was a skeptic in the Islamic tradition. He is actually, unlike most Islamic philosophers, immensely fun to read. Avicenna, I think, is reasonably straightforward. He's not hard to read. Averroes, who we'll get to in a moment, is immensely hard to read. But Al-Ghazali is very penetrating and quite easy to read. Anyway, here's the idea. Why should we think that backwards infinite chain is impossible? What's wrong with it? Well, he says there's nothing wrong with it. Any argument against it would have to be either a priori or a posteriori. But if it were a priori, the only way to do that would be to say there's something contradictory about the idea of an infinite chain of causes going back to the past. He says, look, I don't see anything contradictory about that. The idea that the world's been here infinitely, that doesn't strike me as absurd. In fact, intelligent people have believed it. Could there be a posteriori argument? He says, well, no, and here's why. Because this necessary being, this infinite chain, that could just be the necessary being. Or to put it in Aquinas' terms, that whole causal chain that goes back infinitely, what if that just were the first cause? It were just there, and it had no cause other than itself. So he's really saying, look, the necessary being is that thing that has no reason for its being. Well, he says, think about the whole thing, not about this state of the world, that state of the world, but that whole stretch of the universe through time. Does that have any reason for being? There's a basic philosophical question here. Why is there something rather than nothing? And Al-Ghazali is in effect saying, what if there's no answer to that? What if the existence of the universe itself is just necessary? Well then, gosh, it will be the necessary being. The universe itself would be that being, and it would be filled with all these contingent beings. But on the other hand, that could be. There's no contradiction. But in the end, he doesn't want to be a pantheist. He doesn't want to call that God. Well, Averroes tries to patch the argument up. And he does it by drawing a distinction. He says there are two fundamentally different kinds of things going on. One is causation. Okay, it's the kind of thing that Aquinas had primarily in mind. An agent proceeds from something attached during the process of becoming. So his example here is somebody building a house. The builder builds the house. But once the house is done, the builder's finished, right? It doesn't continue to depend on the existence of that builder. Something can happen to the builder, the house still stands. On the other hand, there's a different kind of dependence, where something actually depends on something else. They go together. They're really inseparable. So here's a way of trying to think about this. One is an efficient cause, of the kind that Aristotle had in mind, a builder to a house, or the motion of one billiard ball causing the motion of another. But the other is a kind of dependence where the act and the object are inseparable. So what would be an example of that? This sort of inseparable dependence. It's not a causal thing of one event and then another event. They go together, they can't really be separated. Here's an example. The height of this table, if it's a standard table, it's about 30 inches high. And the top is about 1 inch. That means the legs have to be about 29 inches high. So I could say the table is 30 inches high. Why? Because the legs are 29 inches high and the top is 1 inch thick. That is not an efficient cause type of explanation. I'm not saying it's like, oh, well, it just happened the legs were this long and the top was this high. Oh, then that happened. But you could get rid of the legs and the top and the table would still be there. It would still be 30 inches high. No, it's not like that. It's a different kind of dependence. And so let's call that kind of inseparable dependence grounding. It's not a term he uses. It's a contemporary sort of term for this. But we could think that sort of relationship is different. So basically he says, look, Al-Ghazali is completely right about efficient causation. The being without an efficient cause could just be that whole chain, that entire chain of events that makes up the universe. But, he says the argument works if Avicenna had in mind not that kind of dependence of something on its efficient cause, but instead this sort of grounding dependence. So here's his picture. Yeah, let the universe be a finite or infinite series of causes. Who cares? It doesn't really matter whether it's finite or infinite, whether there's a first cause in that sense or not. He says what matters is what that depends on, what the ground of the being of that entire sequence that makes up the universe is. So think of this not as something that happens in time, or sort of begins time with some act or something like that. Think instead of the universe as depending on something. Well, could that chain of things on which the existence of the universe depends go on forever? He says, no, there could not be an infinitely descending grounding series. And why not? Well, couldn't that grounded thing just be the descending series? He says no, because an infinite chain of dependencies like this couldn't ground anything. You might think, for example, that what is going on in your mind is grounded in what's happening in your brain. Though what's happening in your brain is grounded in the character, physically, of the things that make it up and the nature of physical laws. But if I then say, well, why are the physical laws are what they are? Why are they these laws instead of some other laws? And suppose I give you some explanation, and it goes on forever. You're going to think, in the end, that's completely ungrounded. You haven't actually told me what any of this rests on. So Averroes says, in the end, that idea of grounding, that idea of an inseparable dependence, doesn't make any sense if it goes on infinitely. There must be something at the bottom of it, and that would be God, the one thing that would actually ground its own existence. Well, is it a good argument that there couldn't be an infinite succession of these grounding things? There's an example of this in Locke, and I'll just go to the little italicized part, which is the story. He says it's kind of like thinking about all the properties of an object in theory. He says, when we ask that, when we say, look, I am a solid being, for example, I fill space, so I have extension, what is the solidity and the extension grounded in? What are they stuck into? He says, I don't know what to say. I'm in the position of an Indian, before mentioned, who saying the world was supported by a great elephant, was asked what the elephant rested on, to which his answer was a great tortoise. But being again pressed to know what gave support to the broad-backed tortoise, he replied, something he knew not what. Well, in the end, there must be something. There's a joke about this, based on Locke, that says, at some point, Bertrand Russell is usually the way the story goes. I don't believe any of it. I think it's made up. But anyway, Russell was giving this talk on the nature of the universe, and some old lady in the audience says, you're completely wrong. I think the universe is supported by a great turtle. And he says, well, then what supports the turtle? She says, oh, you won't get me, young man. It's turtles all the way down. There's something ridiculous about that image, right, of turtles all the way down. It's like, what do you mean it's turtles all the way down? In the end, that is not resting on anything. And that, in effect, is Averroes' argument. If you tell me this depends on that, and that depends on this, and then you say it's turtles all the way down, you haven't explained anything. That doesn't ground a thing. Leibniz picks up on this Averroes argument and puts it in the form that it's known typically in Western philosophy in terms of a principle of sufficient reason. And here it is. Nothing happens without a sufficient reason why it should be so and not otherwise. So everything has an explanation. For anything at all, there is something that explains why it should be that way and not some other way. But now we can ask about the universe as a whole. Why is there something rather than nothing? His answer is there must be a sufficient reason why there is something rather than nothing. And that means there must be a being that is its sufficient reason for its own existence. Well, that something which is its own sufficient reason for existence could only be God. And so his image is very much like that from Averroes. In the end, there might be this chain of dependencies, but in the end, we've got to come back with some reason that is its own reason for existing. And the only thing that could be like that, he says, is a perfect being, namely God. Well, there are issues about these arguments. Why can't there be an infinite regress of these grounds? Let's go back to the same objections that were raised against the Aquinas form of the argument. Here's the way the answer is, I think, supposed to go. Turtles all the way down don't ground anything. That doesn't explain a thing. So the only way that infinite series could look now is not by a sort of infinite past that you might imagine using negative numbers, for example, as your model. Here it's like, no, this would have to depend on infinitely many things, and at some point this just becomes turtles all the way down. That doesn't explain or ground anything. But now, what about this? The other point we had raised. Why should we call that something I know not what? At the bottom of that chain, the thing that is its own sufficient reason for existence, why should we call that God? Well, here's the answer that I think Averroes and Leibniz would give. It's because, well, it is self-grounding. It's its own reason for existing. But now the claim is nothing other than God could be like that. Well, of course, that's sort of just repeating the claim, right? So I think that's not much of an argument. Why couldn't anything other than God be like that? And it becomes a very hard thing to think about. So I would like to say now there's this whole vast literature you could look at to try to learn more. And a lot of people have written on this argument, so there in a sense is. But I think everybody probably shares your sense right now, if I'm looking around this room, gauging your reactions adequately, that when you get to something like this is just super hard to think about. What would it mean that this thing is its own reason for existing? What would it mean that it is its own ground of being? And then, how do I evaluate the claim that that being is God and has those other properties we were talking about? Leibniz says, well, it's because only a perfect thing could be so self-contained, so self-sufficient as to actually exist this way. And in fact, you might think this goes along with a definition of God as the completely self-sufficient being. Some philosophers have defined God that way. In the Latin, they say God is the being that is a se, that is totally self-sufficient, that completely explains or grounds itself. And if we think of God as the self-grounding being, well then this becomes something true by definition, I suppose, as long as we think there could only be one such thing. But now the question is, how do we link that to all those other properties of God? And so it becomes a complicated question.